Beaten and left to die in the road dust, Maren Cole had no way of knowing what happened next would change everything, and the men who put her there had no idea the drifter kneeling over her broken body was the most dangerous gunslinger in the New Mexico territory. Her name was Maren Cole. Summer, 1883. Colfax County, New Mexico territory. She was 24 years old, a widow not yet a year into her grief, and she owned 40 acres of river bottom land that a man named Yeager had been working to steal from her since the ground thawed in April. Before we go any further, partner, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from tonight. What time is it where you are? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to that road, back to the red summer dust, back to the moment everything in Maren Cole's life went from bad to something far, far worse. And then, without warning, to something she had stopped believing in entirely. The land had been Thomas Cole's before it was hers, and he had earned every foot of it the hard way. 6 years he had worked that ground, breaking sod by hand, fencing and refencing against the spring floods that ran off the Cimarron, building a modest beef operation on a 40-acre strip of river bottom that other men had passed over, because the soil looked thin from the road. It did not look thin from underneath, which was why Thomas had stopped and the others had not. He had a water right, a deed, a small herd of mixed-breed cattle, and a wife who had come west from the Texas Panhandle at 18 with nothing but her father's stubbornness in her blood. When the fever took Thomas in October of 1882, it took him fast and all the way, leaving Maren with the herd and the deed and the water right, and 11 months of winter ahead of her, and no one in particular to lean on. She did not write to family for help. She did not ride to Cimarron looking for a hired hand. She had been raised by a man who treated asking for help the same way he treated weakness in any form, as something that, once allowed, would hollow you out if you let it in. So she had kept the herd alive through that first hard winter entirely on her own, working in cold that frosted the inside of her lungs and wind that knocked fence posts loose faster than she could reset them. By the time spring came, she had lost 4 cattle to a storm in February and 3 more to a mountain lion that worked the north fence for 2 weeks before she finally ran it off. And she had slept maybe 5 hours a night for 6 straight months. But the herd was alive, and the land was hers, and the deed was still in the box under the bed where Thomas had kept it. Neighbors who might have helped chose to keep their distance instead. Not out of cruelty mostly. They were people with their own problems and their own hard winters. But there was another reason, and Maren had worked it out clearly enough. Her 40 acres bordered Yeager's eastern pasture, and people in Colfax County were careful about getting between Yeager and something he wanted, Yeager. The name sat in the county the way a stone sits in a clear stream, visible to everyone, not easily moved by anyone. He was not a brutal man in the open, or at least he preferred not to be seen as one. He had a talent for making things look clean from a distance. He owned 3,000 acres west of the Cimarron, and wanted 4,000. And the 40 acres of river bottom he wanted most were the ones with the water right that Thomas Cole had filed in the spring of '79. Yeager had made 2 offers since Thomas died. Both times Maren had turned him down flat and in plain language, and both times Yeager had taken the refusal with a surface-level courtesy that had nothing warm underneath it. After the second refusal, he stopped making offers. He was the kind of man who runs land the way some men run card games, not by playing the best hand, but by controlling who gets to sit at the table. He had bought out 4 small homesteaders in the preceding 3 years, and in every case the transaction had unfolded along a familiar pattern. First a reasonable offer, then a slightly less reasonable offer, then a prolonged season of inconvenience that made the original reasonable offer look better in retrospect than it had at the time. Nobody in the county had ever been able to say in a way that held up to scrutiny that Yeager had done anything wrong. That was how he liked it. The appearance of clean hands was one of his more expensive habits, and he maintained it with care. What came instead was slower and harder to name. A pair of Yeager's hired men would appear along her fence line at odd hours, riding past without stopping, not doing anything she could point to as a threat, just being there. They were at the edge of her pasture in the morning when she drove the cattle out. They were there at dusk when she came back from the north fence. They did not wave. They did not come close. They simply maintained a presence the way cold air maintains a presence through a gap in the wall of a house. You feel it before you can put a finger on exactly where it's coming from. But you know what it means well enough. Yeager's foreman was named Pruitt. Wide through the chest, narrow in his expressions, slow to speak and very fast with his hands, a man who had ridden for Yeager 11 years and had learned to read his employer's quieter signals the way a river pilot reads the current. Pruitt's particular usefulness was this. He could carry out an instruction that had never been formally given. He could look at Yeager's face across a desk and understand, from the angle of the jaw and the direction of the eyes and the silence where a question was not being asked, what it was that Yeager needed to have done, and by whom, and with what degree of visible deniability. It was a talent that made him, in Yeager's estimation, worth more than 3 ordinary foremen. When Yeager stopped making verbal references to the Cole property and started simply looking at it in a particular hard-sided way, Pruitt understood the instruction without needing it spelled out. He assembled 3 men for the job, a lean, tobacco-colored hand named Hurley, who had been in legal trouble in 2 other counties before landing here, a younger man called Doss, who carried a genuine violent streak inside a skin of rough humor, and an older hand named Fletcher, who followed Pruitt's direction and kept his questions to himself. 4 men total, more than the job required, but Pruitt had learned that the surplus of men at the start of an unpleasant errand often saved trouble at the end of it. They came on a Wednesday morning in late July, when the heat had already turned the ground iron hard and the air smelled of red dust and the particular dryness of a New Mexico summer that has been at it long enough to stop apologizing. They brought a document, a paper Yeager's attorney had constructed to look like a legal lien on the Cole property, a claim against a debt that Thomas Cole had allegedly owed before his death. The debt was a complete invention. The lien had been fabricated from nothing, but the paper had a notary seal at the bottom, real ink in a real stamp, because Yeager had been paying the notary in Maren to authenticate things that did not deserve authenticating for the better part of a decade. And the notary had learned to look only at the document and never at what the document was for. Maren was at the north corner of her property, pulling an old fence post, when the 4 riders came over the ridge. She had a crowbar in her right hand, and a rifle leaned against the post hole she was working. When she looked up and saw the shape of 4 men on the skyline, something cold moved through her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. She set the crowbar down. She did not reach for the rifle. She stood in the open ground and waited for them to come to her, because she had always found that making a man ride down to you on your own land was its own form of statement. Pruitt laid out the paper's contents with the flat patience of a man delivering an ultimatum he has dressed up as courtesy. He did not raise his voice. He explained that Yeager's company was entitled to possession of the property within 30 days under the terms of the lien, or that Maren could accept a payment of roughly a third of the land's true value. He delivered this the way a judge delivers a sentence, as though the outcome were already determined, and the explanation were merely a formality being performed out of professional habit. Maren listened to all of it. When he finished, she gave her opinion of the paper, the lien, the notary's seal, and Del Yeager himself in the plainest language she owned, and she did not spare any of it. That was when Pruitt gave the small nod, and Doss got down from his horse. What followed was not clean or brief, and there was no one within earshot to hear it. Doss moved first, open-handed, hard enough to knock her sideways into the post hole she'd been digging. When she lunged for the rifle, Hurley was faster, kicking it clear. Fletcher got her arms from behind, and Pruitt stood back with his arms folded and the look of a man watching a door be forced open, a little bored, a little impatient, waiting for it to be finished so the business could proceed. He did not put his hands on her. He did not need to. He was the reason the others were there. They left her in the dirt when it was over, not because they believed she was dead. Pruitt was too careful for that kind of carelessness, but because they judged that she was hurt badly enough and far enough from any help that the distinction did not matter. They took the rifle. They went into the house and found the deed in its box, and burned it in the yard, and watched the ash until nothing recognizable remained. Then they rode back south to Yeager's ranch, and gave him the report, and Yeager poured himself a drink and did not ask for details. Maren lay in the dust, while the sun moved overhead with its usual total indifference. A turkey vulture appeared 300 feet up and began its slow circles, and she watched it and decided, with the clarity that extreme pain sometimes produces, that she was not going to give it the satisfaction. She got herself off the ground by stages, the way a person does when every stage costs more than the one before. And she started walking north along the trail toward Cimarron, 11 miles distant. She had no water with her. She had no hat, because Doss had knocked it into the post hole when she went down. The sun was directly overhead, and the road was exposed, and the red caliche reflected heat up from below as well as pressing down from above, so that she was walking through heat from two directions simultaneously. She counted her steps for a while. Then she counted fence posts. Then she stopped counting because it was costing her energy she did not have to spare. She made 4 miles. Then her legs stopped cooperating, and she went down in the middle of the road and lay there in the red dust with the afternoon sun flat overhead and the sky above her the particular hard blue of a New Mexico afternoon that has no intention of offering cloud cover to anyone. That was where Silas found her. He had come south off the Raton Pass Road on no particular timetable, riding a mouse-gray gelding named for nothing at all, a horse that had covered enough miles that it moved with a considered economy, not slow, just without waste. Silas himself was built along the same principle. He was somewhere in the decade between 40 and 50, lean in the way that men become lean when they have spent most of their years outdoors, not thin but stripped of everything unnecessary, the way a good knife has no extra steel in it anywhere. His coat was the color of alkali dust from a distance. His hat had been shaped into its current form by years of being pushed back with one thumb while he was reading something a distance away. He wore a single-action revolver on his right hip and a Winchester in the saddle scabbard, the way other men wore their boots, not as statements but as tools, as part of the basic kit for the kind of work he moved through the world doing. He saw the figure in the road from a quarter mile out and took his time approaching it. He had been through enough varied country to know that a body in a road was sometimes exactly what it looked like and sometimes an arrangement, and that the difference between the two was worth being unhurried about. He came in at an angle, reading both sides of the road, checking the brush, watching for the secondary sign that would tell him what the primary sign was not. No horses nearby. No fresh tracks in the caliche cutting back toward the brush. No movement in the tree line on either side. Just a woman in the dust, breathing shallow. He stepped down and knelt beside her and pulled a clean cloth from his saddle kit and pressed it against the cut above her eye, and spoke to her in the low, steady register he used for horses and for people in bad situations, asking her to stay with him, asking her name. She was conscious enough to give it. He was still kneeling when he became aware of a particular quality of silence in the brush to the east, the kind of silence that is not natural, that has a presence behind it. He did not change his posture or his voice. He simply waited, because he had learned that in these situations the patience was usually with the man who did not move. After a while he heard the sound of a horse being turned, and then hooves on hardpan, and then nothing but the natural sounds of the afternoon. Hurley had circled back on Pruitt's instruction, back to confirm that Maren Cole had not gotten up and walked anywhere inconvenient. He had pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the brush, and looked at the man kneeling in the road, and his hand had gone to his revolver and stopped there, because something about the man kneeling in the road had introduced a cold and specific kind of doubt into his mind. The coat, the horse's brand, the absolute stillness of the man's posture, not the stillness of someone absorbed in a task, but the stillness of someone who was performing a task and simultaneously doing something else entirely, something that required keeping very still. Hurley had seen that quality in maybe 2 men in his life. Both those men had cost him dearly in different ways. He looked at the gray gelding's brand again. Then he put his horse around and rode hard south and did not decelerate until Yeager's buildings were visible, and when he arrived he went first to find Pruitt, and only secondarily to put up his horse, which indicated the degree of his urgency. The man in the road was Silas Reeve. In Colfax County in the summer of 1883, that name needed no explanation for anyone who had worked the country west of the Pecos for more than a season. Silas Reeve had been a lawman once, briefly, before deciding that the formal law moved at a pace that bore no relationship to the pace of the problems he was being asked to address. After that, he had been other things in sequence: cattle detective, range investigator, a man called in by land companies and territorial interests when they had a problem that the official machinery was too slow, too corrupt, or too frightened to handle cleanly. He had put down the Harker brothers in Cimarron in 78 under circumstances that people who heard the account afterward refused to believe, and people who had been present refused to describe in detail, because the detail was the kind that gave ordinary men bad dreams. He had walked into a camp of 9 armed men in the Sangre de Cristos in the winter of 1880 and come back out with 4 prisoners, unhurt, moving with the same considered economy he brought to everything else, as though 9 armed men in the mountains were simply a logistical problem he had worked through on the ride in. He did not discuss any of it. The stories had propagated without his involvement, the way stories do in country where distance makes every piece of news matter. Some of the stories were accurate. Some had been magnified in the retelling, the way distances are magnified in clear desert air. The thing is real, but the apparent scale is not. He had stopped trying to distinguish between the accurate ones and the inflated ones, because he had found that the distinction mattered less to the people who heard the stories than the core of each one. and the core was usually true enough. He had learned to treat his own reputation the way he treated weather, as something real that required no attention from him. None of this was apparent when he carried Maren Cole 2 miles east to a line shack he knew, a place used seasonally by ranchers pushing cattle north and empty now in the late summer heat. It was weather-tight, with a hand pump that functioned and a small iron stove that needed little encouragement. He got the stove going. He got water heating. He cleaned the cuts on her face with the efficiency of someone who has done field medicine in places without access to a doctor, and he identified by watching the way she breathed when he shifted her, the bruising along her ribs that she had not yet had occasion to report. He put her on the cot and took the chair by the door with his rifle across his knees and sat there through the night with the patience of a man who does not distinguish between the kinds of waiting he is asked to do. She was awake before first light. She lay still for a moment, working through where she was and why, and then she looked at the man in the chair and the man looked at her, and neither of them rushed the next several seconds. She gave her name again. Then she laid out the whole of it: Yeager, the fraudulent lien, Pruitt, the 4 men, the deed burned in her yard. She laid it out with the directness of a person who has concluded that the cost of withholding information is too high to keep paying. She told him about Thomas and the water right, and the 6 years of work that had gone into those 40 acres. She told him about the winter she had come through alone. She told him about the offers Yeager had made and what she had done with each of them. He listened with the quality of attention that some people mistake for blankness. No responsive expressions, no small sounds of sympathy, no questions until the person was finished. When she was finished, he let a beat of silence stand. "How far to the nearest law?" he finally put to her. "Maren, 22 miles. Sheriff Bates." She paused. "He's on Yeager's payroll." "A scared man or a dishonest one?" "Cowardly. He won't do something cruel on purpose. He just won't do anything useful if Yeager's interests point the other way." "Then we leave him out of it," he said. She caught the pronoun and looked at him. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But I know the kind of problem you have, and I'm not in a hurry." She looked at him for a long moment with the level appraisal of someone who has learned to take the measure of things before she commits to them. Then she let it rest. She had been through enough in the last 24 hours that an unexpected offer of help felt less like a complication than it might have a year ago. She told him her name was Maren and that she did not know his. "Silas," he said. "Just Silas?" "That's what I go by." She decided to accept it for the time being. There were more immediate questions. They stayed through that first day at the line shack, with him asking and her answering. The layout of her 40 acres, the structures, the water source, the approaches from each direction. He wanted to know about the terrain near the creek crossing, the sight line from the south ridge, the old stone wall along the north fence. He wanted to know about Pruitt's men, how they moved, whether they favored daylight or dark, whether Pruitt was the kind of foreman who gave his men latitude or kept them on a short line. She answered everything with the precision of a person who had been paying close attention to all of it for months with nowhere to put the information. They went back to her property before dawn the next morning. Silas walked every foot of it in the pre-dawn gray, covering the barn and the root cellar and the creek bottom and the ridge, and Maren walked with him and did not ask what he was looking for. She understood that he would surface what mattered when he had found it. Yeager's men had not returned yet. The land was quiet in the way of a place holding its breath. She knew they would be back, not because she had evidence, but because she knew the shape of what Yeager had started. And men like Yeager did not start things they were not prepared to finish. Silas found the root cellar behind the barn, its door nearly level with the ground, hinged to open outward. He found the old stone wall along the north fence, 2 feet of stacked rock that would stop a horse and slow a man considerably. He found the narrow lane that ran between the barn corner and the creek, the natural choke point, the place where riders coming from the east would have to slow and file in one at a time regardless of how many of them there were. He stood on the south ridge for a long while, looking back down at the property and the road, and working through the angles in his head, with the quiet thoroughness of someone who has stood on ridges before this one for similar reasons. That afternoon, while the light still had an hour in it, he came to the barn where she was working on the axle of her wagon. She had no intention of letting his presence change her routine, because the wagon axle needed attention, and the axle did not care who was on her property, and he sat on a hay bale and looked at her in the direct, undecorated way he had of looking at things. "Can you shoot?" he said. She put down the wrench. "My husband taught me." "How well?" She considered the honest answer. "Well enough to hit what I'm pointing at, if I'm not nervous." He pushed up off the hay bale. "Come out to the back pasture," he said. "Bring whatever you've got." What she had was a short-barreled Colt that Thomas had kept loaded under the kitchen counter, the last gun Pruitt's men had not found, because they hadn't looked there. It was a fine weapon, well cared for. She handled it without the particular nervousness that comes from unfamiliarity, but when they got to the back pasture, Silas saw immediately that she braced for the shot a half-beat before it came, a small, unconscious tensing that caused the barrel to drift left and low at the moment of firing. He showed her what he meant. He did not lecture. He demonstrated twice, cleanly, the quality of stillness required before a shot. Not held breath, but released breath. Not the grip of tension, but its absence. The gun an extension of the arm rather than a thing being wrestled. He stepped back and watched her work it out. He had found that capable people locate a thing faster on their own once someone has shown them the direction it's in. She fired 6 shots at a fence post 40 feet distant, all 6 clustered in a pattern you could cover with the flat of your hat. He looked at the post for a moment. Then he looked at her. "There it is," he said, in a tone that was not praise but recognition, the same tone he would use to identify a ford in a creek or a good spot to camp, meaning simply that the thing existed and was now confirmed. She kept her expression level, because what she felt in that moment was not something she was prepared to put on her face. It was not pride exactly. It was something colder and more specific. The knowledge that she had been standing on this land for 11 months, practicing a kind of solitude that had quietly been eating her alive, and that this afternoon in the back pasture was a crack in the wall of it she was not going to brick back up. That evening Silas set the tripwires. He ran a length of wire at shin height across the East Lane approach, the narrow choke point between the barn and the creek, and tied it to a pair of tin cans filled with creek gravel. He ran a second line between the 2 cottonwood trees on the north path, the other likely approach, and attached it to the cowbell he found hanging in the barn. At the root cellar he constructed a third arrangement, lower and quieter, a wire connected to the wooden prop stick holding the cellar door cover open. Anyone stepping on that wire in the dark would find the cover dropping away and 4 feet of empty cellar below them before they understood what had happened. He walked through each setup with Maren as he laid it, naming the exact locations, because she was going to be moving around this property in the dark, and the knowledge of what the dark contained was the difference between an advantage and a hazard. When the wiring was done, they sat at the kitchen table with the lamp low and worked through the details of what would happen if men came that night. Where she would position herself, when she would move, and when she would hold still. What angle on Pruitt she might find from the barn's north corner, and what to do with it if she found it. He laid this out with the practical directness of someone who has rehearsed for this kind of night before and has long since stopped finding the rehearsal remarkable. At some point in the working through of these details, she put her coffee cup down and looked at him squarely. "You gonna tell me who you really are?" she said. "Because there's something about the way you've been moving around this land that doesn't fit a man who says he goes by just Silas." He was quiet for a moment, unhurried. "The rider who circled back on the road," he said. "The one who turned around without a word. That tells you more than my name does. I'm asking for your name." "Silas Reeve," he said. And then, "I imagine Pruitt knows by now, too." She sat with that. The name was not unknown to her, not specific in its details, but known in the general way that certain names were known in the territories, names that accumulated around themselves a sense of weight without anyone formally tracking the weight's origins. Silas Reeve. She had heard it once, maybe twice, in contexts she had not paid close attention to at the time. "Does knowing who you are make them more likely to come anyway?" she said. "Pruitt's the kind who comes anyway," he said. "Some men are like that. They've committed too much to back down cleanly, and they can't find a door that doesn't look like defeat. So they come. The difference is they'll come careful." "And Doss?" "Doss will come angry. Angry men make noise, and noise is useful." She absorbed this. The lamp guttered slightly in a draft through the window gap. "You had a family once," she said. It was not a question, but an observation, something she had worked out from watching him move around the property with a particular attention to what could be protected and what couldn't. A man didn't look at a house that way unless he had at some point stood in front of a house that needed protecting and found himself on the wrong side of the distance. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the night had settled into crickets and a distant coyote and the soft movement of the horses in the pasture. "In the mountains north of Santa Fe," he said finally. 1874. My wife." He stopped there and let the stopping carry what the words would have needed to carry otherwise. She did not ask what came after. She understood enough of the shape of it from what he did and did not say. "I'm sorry," she said. "I went after the men responsible," he said. "All of them. Took 2 years. After that, the work was what I knew how to do, so the work was what I kept doing." He lifted his coffee cup and set it down without drinking from it. "Some people find their way back to something else. I didn't. That's not a complaint. It's just what happened." It was the longest thing she had heard him say, and she understood he would not say more, and she did not ask for more. They sat in a quiet that was not uncomfortable, the particular quiet of two people who are at peace with what they do not know about each other, because they are clear on what they do know. She banked the fire low the way he had instructed. She went to the bedroom. He moved the chair to the front window, settled with the rifle across his knees, and the night closed in around the house and the barn and the 40 acres of Maren Cole's land that was still, against everything Yeager had thrown at it, hers. They came at 2 a.m, not the full complement of Yeager's crew. Pruitt was not reckless with resources when he could help it. He brought Doss, whose anger he considered a deployable tool, and Hurley, who had overcorrected from his moment of good judgment on the road and come back out of something like professional shame, and a fourth man, a compact, quiet figure on a paint horse that Hurley had brought in from his own contacts as additional insurance, because Hurley had conveyed to Pruitt exactly whose horse he had seen on the South Road, and Pruitt had decided that 2-to-1 was not adequate arithmetic for what Silas Reeve represented. The first tripwire caught Doss's horse at the East Lane approach. The tin cans rattled in a hard clatter that carried clear in the still night air, and the horse shied left, and Doss swore at a volume that removed any remaining element of surprise from his arrival. By the time that sound reached Silas, he was already away from the front window and moving. His voice went into the dark, steady, carrying, the kind of voice that puts itself across open country without effort. "Cale Pruitt. That's far enough." A pause. Then Pruitt's voice from the dark, controlled. "Who's there?" "You know who's here. Hurley told you." A longer pause. Then the murmur of Pruitt giving instructions, low, directional, spreading his men out to flank the house from both sides, which was the disciplined approach and also, in this case, exactly what Silas had prepared for. He moved through the back door, staying low, keeping the barn's bulk between himself and the East Lane. The night was dark, but not black. Enough starlight to read shapes by. Enough to move without making noise if you knew where you were going and had already decided where you were going before the dark arrived. The cowbell went off on the north path, a muffled clang, then a heavier crash that was a large man going through the root cellar cover with both feet and dropping into 4 feet of air. Fletcher, apparently, had found the third wire with his heel and had experienced the kind of surprise that removes men from the problem set entirely for the relevant duration. Doss made a run at the East Lane on foot after his horse proved uncooperative. The second wire at shin height caught him cleanly across both legs and put him into the dirt with full momentum, and the rifle he had been carrying went 2 directions from him in the dark, and neither direction was toward his hands. He lay there taking inventory of the situation, which took longer than he expected. That left Pruitt and the man on the paint horse. Pruitt had moved up the East Lane on foot after watching Doss's approach fail, and he moved without noise, reading the unfamiliar ground by starlight with the competence of someone who has done this kind of work in the dark before. He was good at it. He came around the north corner of the barn with the unhurried precision of a careful man making his play, and he was, at that moment, looking in almost precisely the right direction. Almost. Maren had come out of the house through the back window, low, quiet, across the kitchen garden, along the wall of the house, and around to the north corner of the barn, and she was standing in the shadow of the barn wall with the Colt in both hands, and the particular quality of stillness she had found that afternoon in the back pasture. Pruitt came around the corner and saw her in the same half-second she saw him, and everything that followed happened very fast. She did not brace. She released the breath and put the shot where she had been shown to put it, and Pruitt went down hard on his back. He was not dead. The shot had caught him below the ribs on the right side, enough to put him on the ground and keep him there, not enough to kill him. He lay with one hand pressed against his side, and his rifle arm flat in the dirt, and no intention of reaching for anything. The man on the paint horse had positioned himself east of the property in the brush, and had watched the last 90 seconds with the quality of attention that a man gives to events that he is reconsidering his involvement in. He turned his horse and pushed it south toward Yeager's ranch at a speed suggesting genuine urgency. He made half a mile before Silas's voice came from behind him in the dark, calm, carrying, not especially hurried. "Keep riding if that's your choice," the voice said. "Go back to Yeager. Tell him what you saw tonight. Tell him Maren Cole is still on her land. Tell him who's with her. He can work out what comes next from that." The rider held his horse for a long moment on the dark road. Then he rode on south. He did not stop at Yeager's ranch long enough to unsaddle. Doss was sitting in the East Lane dirt with his face in his hands. Hurley had not made it over the fence at all. He had heard the cowbell clang and the crash of Fletcher dropping through the cellar cover and the shot, and had made a quiet private calculation and pointed his horse northeast without a formal announcement. He did not have a specific destination in mind, which suited him fine. Fletcher was in the root cellar, unhurt but shaken, his composure scattered among the 4 feet of dark he had not expected to fall through. Silas got Fletcher out and collected Doss and sat them both in the yard and gave them, in a conversational tone, their options. Yeager's ranch, or somewhere else altogether. No follow-up either way. He had no interest in following either of them. The choice was straightforward. They chose Yeager's ranch, which meant they sat in Yeager's study that morning and gave him the full account of everything that had happened. And Yeager listened to all of it with the stillness of a man who is doing arithmetic he is not happy with and cannot make come out differently no matter how he arranges the numbers. Del Yeager was not a stupid man. He was greedy and ruthless, and he had confused those qualities for strength for long enough that the confusion had become habitual, but he was not stupid. What he heard in the accounts those men brought him was not simply a failed operation. It was the specific sound of exposure, the fraudulent lien, the fabricated debt, the notary seal applied to a document designed to dispossess a widow of land she had earned. All of it was paper, and Silas Reeves' method, going back 20 years, was to find the paper underneath whatever he had been sent in to address and make sure it reached the people who needed to see it. Yeager sent a writer to his attorney in Cimarron the same morning, carrying a letter that retracted the lien in full. The language was careful and bloodless. Made in error, hereby withdrawn, no further claim asserted. It did not explain what error had produced a notarized lien against a debt that had never existed. It simply withdrew the document. It was not enough. Silas made sure of that. He located the notary in Cimarron 2 days after the night at the property. A small, frightened man named Aldridge, who had been authenticating Yeager's arrangements for the better part of a decade, and had constructed, over those years, an elaborate internal architecture of distinctions between what he did and what he knew, designed to allow him to believe he was not responsible for the consequences of either. Silas sat across from him at a table in the back of the assay office where Aldridge kept his secondary work, and laid out, without raising his voice, what he knew, what he could prove, and what the territorial penalty for notarial fraud currently was. Aldridge sat with the expression of a man watching a wall he has relied on for years reveal that it is not structural. He gave a deposition that same afternoon. The deposition was specific. It named Yeager. It described the instruction Aldridge had received regarding the Cole lien and 3 other documents of similar character that Aldridge had authenticated over the preceding 5 years. Silas sent copies to the Federal Land Office in Santa Fe, to the Territorial Governor's Correspondence Office, and to a newspaper editor in Cimarron named Hargraves, who had been waiting, with professional patience, for exactly this quality of documented material before he was willing to put his name on a story. Hargraves ran it on Thursday. By Friday there were 2 men from Santa Fe at Yeager's ranch gate, and they were not guests.
By Monday, Yeager had retained a defense attorney, and the lien on Maren Cole's property had been entered into the Colfax County land record as fraudulent, a notation that would remain attached to that document for as long as the record existed. The scrutiny, once it arrived, extended to 3 other Yeager property claims. 2 of those claims did not survive the examination.
It was slower than a gun would have been, and less immediately satisfying in the way that guns produce satisfaction, which is immediate and complete, and does not generally require follow-up paperwork. But it was thorough, and thoroughness Silas had found over a long career of addressing things that needed addressing tended to last. Pruitt recovered from the wound and left the county before the federal examiners arrived, which was a sensible decision under the circumstances. Doss left the county the same week, apparently having concluded that Colfax County in particular held nothing further for him at this time. Hurley was already gone, and remained gone. Fletcher returned to Yeager's ranch briefly, collected his wages and what remained of his gear, and rode north toward Colorado without a forwarding address. Del Yeager did not leave. He stayed on his 3,000 acres and worked with his attorney on the federal matter, and did not make any further reference to the Cole property, in writing or in conversation, for the remainder of his time in the county. Maren Cole's 40 acres remained hers. The deed burned in her yard was replaced through the Territorial Land Office, a process that required more paperwork than it should have and less time than she had feared, and which produced a new document properly witnessed and filed, with her name on it in ink that was not going to disappear. She found Silas at the barn on a morning about 10 days after the night Pruitt had come. He was saddling the gray gelding with the methodical attention of a man who is going somewhere and has been going somewhere for most of his life and finds the process of departure routine. She understood what she was looking at. She leaned against the barn door and watched him. "South," she said. "For now." He pulled the cinch and checked it. "You've got the land. You've got the deed. You can shoot. That's what needed doing. You could stay a little while longer. A little while, maybe." He turned and looked at her with the directness that was his way of looking at things. "But I'm more used somewhere else than I am here once the work is done. That's just how it is." She pushed off the door frame and walked to him. She was not a woman who approached difficult things sideways, and she had no reason to start now. She told him plainly that she knew what he had done and what it had cost, the days and the nights and the federal contact work and the careful management of Aldridge and all the rest, and that she was not going to let him ride out as though it were nothing, because it was not nothing, and they both knew it. He listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he held out his hand, and she took it, and they held the grip for a moment that was neither short nor long, but exactly what it needed to be. "You'll be all right," he told her. "I know that," she said. She had known it since the afternoon in the back pasture, not as a hope but as a confirmed fact, the way the fence post had been a confirmed fact with 6 rounds in it. She was going to be all right. She had been going to be all right all along. It had just taken nearly dying on a dusty road to put her back in contact with the knowledge. He rode south. She stood in the yard and watched him until the dust settled back out of the air and the road was empty, and the silence returned, the specific, particular silence of her own land, which she had learned to read over 11 months the way her father had taught her to read weather, by feel before anything else. She went back to the house. She put the Colt back under the kitchen counter. She made a pot of coffee. She drank it standing at the window, looking out at the pasture and the barn and the north fence line running clean and straight in the morning light, and she thought about what she was going to do next, which was the same thing she had been doing every morning for 11 months, the same practical calculation of what needed attention today, what could wait until tomorrow, what she was going to build and repair and improve and grow on these 40 acres that were hers and were going to remain hers. The calculation felt different than it had before. Not easier, exactly. Just different, the way a room feels different after you have let some air into it. That evening, she wrote to her sister in Colorado, the first letter she had written to anyone since Thomas's funeral. She told the story from the beginning, plainly, the way she told everything. She described Pruitt and the burned deed and the 4 miles of road and the man who had stopped. She described the back pasture afternoon with the fence post and the 6 rounds. She described the night with the tripwires and the cowbell and the shot from the barn's shadow. She described the notary's deposition and Hargrave's story and the men from Santa Fe. At the end, she added one more paragraph. She wrote, "I stayed on. I intend to keep staying on. Come out if you want to see the place. It's better than I've made it sound to you all these years." She sealed the letter and set it out for the morning rider. Then she lit the lamp and sat down at the kitchen table and drew up the list of what she was going to do to the barn roof before the cold came. "Now, partner, I want you to sit with what this story is really about for a moment, because it is not quite what it looks like at a first glance. On the surface, it is about a gunfight in the dark, and a fraudulent deed, and a drifter who turns out to be something considerably more than a drifter. But underneath it is the story of a woman who had practiced being alone so long and so hard that it had almost become indistinguishable from courage. She had been standing on her own land for 11 months with her pride wrapped around her the way you wrap a wound, not to heal it, but to keep moving despite it. And the problem with that approach, as she nearly demonstrated permanently on that 4-mile stretch of road, is that it has a weight limit. Maren Cole did not need Silas Reeve to solve her problems for her. She needed someone to stand beside her long enough for her to solve them herself. There is a difference between those two things, and it is not a small one. The shot from the barn corner was hers. The knowledge that she was capable of taking it was always hers. What she got from those 10 days was not rescue, it was confirmation. The reminder that asking for help is not the same as admitting you can't handle your own life. Sometimes it is just the thing a person does when the problem in front of them is bigger than the problem they were designed to solve alone, and recognizing that particular distinction is not weakness. It is, in my considerable experience by this fire, the beginning of a certain kind of wisdom. And Silas Reeve rode south with something he had not ridden north with, though he would not have put a name to it if you had asked him, because he was not the kind of man who named things that did not require naming. He had spent 9 years moving through the world doing work that needed doing, and that work had been good work, honest work, useful work, and yet something about the 10 days in Colfax County sat differently from the other jobs because the work had stayed when he left. The land was there. The deed was there. The woman was there, alive and clear-eyed, and drawing up barn roof lists in the lamplight. He had put something back together that had been taken apart, and it was going to remain put together. And that was a thing worth carrying forward into whatever came south of there. Your past may explain you, partner, every hard mile of it. But it does not have to be everything you are. That is true for Maren, and it was true for Silas, and it is probably true for whatever piece of your own history you are carrying around tonight. Wherever you are, whatever time it is where you are. If this story found you at 2 a.m. when sleep won't cooperate, or on a long drive with the miles stacking up in front of you, or just in a quiet house with a cup of something warm, I'm glad it was here when you needed something to listen to. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is. I read all of those, every one. If you haven't subscribed, do it now. It keeps this fire burning and the stories coming. And if this one landed for you tonight, pass it along to someone who might need a reminder that the trail doesn't end just because you went down on it. Keep your powder dry, partner. And your soul honest. Until our trails cross again. This story is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. The characters, events, and locations depicted are entirely fictional and are not intended to represent any real persons, living or dead, or actual historical events. Any resemblance to real individuals or occurrences is entirely coincidental. This content is produced for entertainment purposes only.